perfect storm. Everyone these days wants to describe everything as a perfect storm, making it hard to distinguish when an incredibly rare confluence of events produces something historically destructive, and when someone just wants to use the phrase, a perfect storm, to lend whatever minor crisis they're describing some dramatic heft. Really, I promise you, the overuse of a perfect storm is a big pet peeve of mine. With that in mind, the crisis of the 3rd century was a perfect storm. The empire was already being ravaged by external pressures stronger than it had known in centuries, violent internal political division, economic depression, soaring taxation, and now, on top of everything else, a massive plague was breaking out. You guys, this is what a perfect storm looks like. At the height of the Cyprian plague, which ran from 251 until sometime after 270, 5,000 people died every day in Rome, and the bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Manpower shortages inevitably resulted in the fields and in the army barracks, leading to further economic depression, famine, and anemic border defense. This at a time when the last thing the empire could afford was economic depression, famine, and anemic border defense. Besides Hostilian, the plague would eventually claim the life of the Emperor Claudius Gothicus as well, a man who was well on his way to leading Rome out of the darkness when he died prematurely in his camp. Really, I will never stop marveling at how the Roman Empire was able to survive the 3rd century. Everyone always wants to know why Rome fell, but I think the more fascinating question is how it managed to survive as long as it did. Over the course of the next few episodes, I hope to get to the bottom of that particular mystery. Seriously, these were bad times that the Romans should not have lived through. Though the Romans had been focused for the last few years on the threat in the north posed by the Goths, it was during the short reign of Gallus that they were reminded that the Sassanids still posed a major threat in the east. Shapur had been biding his time after making peace with Philip the Arab back in 244, but once word trickled over to the Sassanid king that the Romans were getting battered around by a Gothic invasion, it did not take him long to call an army back into the field and point them west. The strength of Rome was at a low ebb, and now was the perfect opportunity to maybe peel off some of that old Persian territory his family had been coveting all these years. The results of Shapur's campaign would prove as disastrous to the Romans as Caneva's campaign had just been, and when the Romans finally got around to responding, the results of that campaign would prove to be even more disastrous still. Bad times. Bad times. As is so often the case in Roman history, Armenia lay at the center of this latest outbreak of hostilities between East and West. The chronology on all of this is a bit muddled, but it appears that Shapur used a dispute over Armenian succession as a pretext for invading the Buffer Kingdom. After marching around unopposed and placing his own man on the throne, Shapur then shocked everyone by directly invading the Roman province of Syria. As had just happened in the north, the eastern legions were so used to simply keeping watch without any real fear of direct attack that the sudden invasion caught them completely by surprise. Shapur captured key legionary garrisons and sacked important cities, including, amazingly, Antioch itself. After his string of victories, Shapur chose to withdraw from Syria as winter descended, rather than attempt an occupation at this early stage in the game. Rome may be weakened, but it certainly wasn't defenseless. The easy success of his initial foray into Roman territory, though, had to have had Shapur's mouth watering. Back in Rome, the surprising news of this marauding Sassanid army was met by an equally surprising reaction from the Emperor Gallus: relative indifference. He ordered the Syrian legions to regroup and defend themselves properly the next time Shapur came calling, but other than that, he made no move to travel to Syria himself, or to raise emergency reinforcements to help shore up the Eastern Front. This latter bit is at least somewhat understandable, as the North was already stretched dangerously thin, and the plague was making recruiting difficult. But there's no getting around the fact that Gallus did not seem much moved by the danger posed by the Sassanids. Perhaps had he lived, he would have done as Valerian eventually did, and led the counterattack personally. But Romans at the time whispered that perhaps there was more soft Italian in Gallus than he liked to let on, and that the luxuries of Rome were seducing him away from his responsibilities. Discontentment with Gallus, as you can imagine, began to grow apace from this point on. With all of this swirling around, bad news once again came down from the Danube in 253. Cneva let it be known that he was unhappy about the payments he had been promised, and if Gallus didn't do something about it, the Gothic king was going to consider their peace treaty null and void. It is unclear whether the Romans were actually withholding the funds they had promised, or whether Cneva was simply trying to extort more cash from his weakened opponent, but the word went back up to give the Gothic king no more than he had already been given. Cneva, insulted, made preparations for a new invasion of the empire. After Gallus left for Rome, the man put in charge of the northern border was Marcus Aemilius Aemilianus, a general of North African extraction who had been appointed to a legionary command in Moesia by Decius following the disaster at Abritus. Aemilianus faced the frightening prospect of dealing with the same Gothic army that had just whipped the Romans handily, only this time with fewer men and more raw recruits. The odds, needless to say, were not in his favor. When Cneva did cross the Danube in 253, though, the Gothic king let his arrogance get the better of him, and Aemilianus was able to surprise the Goths and deliver a smashing victory for the legions. This time, it was Cneva who found himself leading off the wounded remnants of a once mighty army, and the world was reminded that the Romans were not done for yet. Aemilianus was an overnight sensation, and for having done what two emperors had been unable to do, the exuberant troops honored their general the best way they knew how. They proclaimed him emperor. And if you think that by acclaiming their fourth emperor in just 5 years, the Moesian legions were hitting the peak of their fickleness, well, let's just give it another 3 months. The news that the men who had proclaimed him emperor were now proclaiming someone else emperor finally roused Gallus from his apparent slumber. He sent an order up to Valerian, the commander of the Upper Rhine, and the man Decius had tried to make censor, demanding that Valerian lead his troops to Italy at once to help Gallus smack down this would-be usurper. The emperor then induced the Senate to declare Aemilianus an enemy of the state, and he gathered up a defense force and marched north to prevent the Moesian legions from entering Italy. But Aemilianus was well aware that time was of the essence, and while Gallus gathered his defenses, the Moesian general was already marching on Italy to cement his claim to the throne. The Danube legions had been weakened by war and disease, and if Aemilianus was to have any shot at all at unseating Gallus, he needed to strike before the emperor could muster all the forces at his disposal. If he was thinking in particular about the Rhine legions, then he was right to move fast. By getting to Gallus before the Rhine troops did, he was able to emerge victorious from something approaching an equal contest. Not that it did him much good. Fast or slow, when the Rhine legions did arrive, Aemilianus found himself done for anyway. But we'll get to that in a minute. Aemilianus was already in Italy and speeding down the eastern branch of the Flaminian Way when he was finally met by an army led by Gallus and Volusianus. There are two accounts of what happened next. The first states that Aemilianus defeated Gallus after a short battle, and that Gallus and his son then fled north to await the coming Rhine reinforcements. Their way was then cut short by members of the Praetorian Guard, who saw the wind shifting in Aemilianus' favor, and figured that they could get in good with the new emperor by bringing him the head of the old. They murdered Gallus and Volusianus, leaving Aemilianus' path to the throne clear. The other account is that there was no battle at all, and that Gallus' troops defected to Aemilianus before a single spear was thrown, leaving Gallus and Volusianus alone and unprotected, at which point they were executed by Aemilianus. Whichever way it happened, by the end of August 253, Gallus was dead. He was 47 years old and had ruled the empire for 2 years. The death of Gallus ushered in the glorious reign of Emperor Aemilianus, which began the moment Gallus died and ended the moment Valerian arrived in Italy with the Rhine legions. This glorious reign probably lasted about a month. When the new emperor arrived in Rome, he was greeted coolly by the Senate. Gallus had not been their first choice to lead the empire, and they were probably no more pleased with his lingering in the capital than anyone else, but he had gone out of his way to avoid civil war by proposing joint rule with Hostilian. Civil war was the last thing the empire needed, and here now was a man who had gone ahead and started one anyway. Aemilianus was not unaware of his standing in the capital, so when he arrived, he went to great lengths to convince the Senate of his benign intentions. He told the senators that he saw himself merely as a general, and that he had neither the time nor the inclination to be the political, economic, and moral leader of the empire. That, he said, would be the Senate's responsibility. He himself would be too busy defending Rome from its foreign enemies to worry about politics. He planned, he said, to be but an instrument of the empire, and more specifically, an instrument of the Senate. Their egos now more than satisfied, any opposition to Aemilianus washed away as they contemplated this enticing new dynamic he had proposed. A partnership between the military and the civilian authorities, rather than all power being claimed by a single man. It was a positively intoxicating thought for the power-starved Senate. But like I say, the glorious reign of Aemilianus only lasted a few weeks. Valerian had never stopped moving south after the death of Gallus, and he now entered Italy in mid to late 253, with an eye not on saving Gallus, but revenging him. Aemilianus' position was now reversed, and just a few weeks after marching down the Flaminian Way to confront Gallus, he found himself marching right back up it again to confront Valerian. On the same eastern branch of the road, though a bit further south, the two commanders met at the heads of their respective armies. Overawed by both the larger force from the Rhine and by the reputation of Valerian, the Moesian legions once again abandoned their master in favor of another and defected en masse to Valerian. In the process of this defection, Aemilianus was cornered and killed by his own officers, so that there would be no misunderstanding where their new loyalties lay. Aemilianus was in his early 40s and had enjoyed the novelty of calling himself emperor for just about 3 months. The death of the crisis of the 3rd century. This first phase, running roughly from 238 to 253, set the tone for the remainder of the crisis. The legions elevating and abandoning emperors, the Goths invading from the north, the Sassanids invading from the east, the Cyprian plague sucking the life out of Rome's army and economy, and in general,